Hello, John and Sue. How you doing?
All right, thank you.
So we're here to talk about the character of Moses in Exodus. You guys, what's your initial thoughts?
I think he's obedient. I think that's probably the thing that I think he's very flawed, and he's a bit feeble at times actually. But I think there's something about him that he kind of wanders off a bit, and he does stuff that show that he doesn't always get it, but he is. I think he comes back again and again.
Do you think he starts off with anger issues?
Is it anger, or is it injustice issues, and is it about identity?
Maybe.
I mean, he's saved as a baby. He doesn't know anything about that, but he's brought up kind of by his mum in the Egyptian court as an Egyptian, but he kind of presumably knows he's a Hebrew, and there's that whole question of, well, who am I? And then to see the guys being, his own countrymen being pushed around, is there an identification there with the underdog? Is it about justice?
We don't know what he's told as a child, do we? From his real mum and his adopted mum, so to speak.
I wonder if it would have been quite precarious, because the whole point that his kind of adopted mum saved him was because the decree was to kill all the Hebrew babies, but presumably, he'd been circumcised, so whoever was changing his nappy would know that he was a Hebrew baby. Yeah. So I would have thought that his adopted mum would have known that. She deliberately got a Hebrew woman to look after him. So I wonder if there was some sense of. I would think his upbringing would have been a bit dysfunctional in some ways. There would have been.
I think there might have been some abandonment issues,
yeah,
maybe.
I would think so.
Or guilt, survivor issues as well.
Guilt,
I mean,
maybe.
His peers would have been destroyed as babies. He's alive.
Because the fact that he attacks that man, he kills that man for attacking an Israelite, clearly shows that he identifies with the Hebrews.
I mean, it's a classic, isn't he? Where does he fit?
Yeah.
He's living in the Egyptian court, but he's a Hebrew. He goes to the Hebrew people, and he looks like an Egyptian, and they don't, who gives you authority over us, they say. Yeah. So he's kind of like in a no man's land.
He starts off there, but obviously God intervenes. God comes into his life. God has chosen him for a specific purpose. So where do we go from there?
Well, he spends 40 years being a shepherd, doesn't he? I mean, I think that, to me, that's the biggest juxtaposition, really, to somebody who's been brought up in the king's household as a grandson, who's then a shepherd for 40 years. And I kind of think, 40 years is a long time, isn't it? If you take 40 years out of my life.
But it's such a brief moment in the story, isn't it? It's like a few lines. It's almost like a throwaway.
Yeah.
You could miss it.
Yeah.
We focus so much on like the big dramatic stuff, all the plagues of Egypt, and then like you look at this line that says, he was in the wilderness for 40 years, and it's like, whoa, hang on a sec. It's that's a full life in itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's like the Jesus story, we get 3 years, we get the birth narratives, and then we get a brief appearance at 12, and then like nothing until he's 30-ish, and then onto the scene for a brief period of ministry. But really, most of the Gospels concentrate on that last week. So Moses, you've got a similar sort of thing. You get a bit about his birth, and then you get a little sort of introductory period about the temperament of the guy. Then for 40 years, he's like in no man's land. And then he's on the scene sort of big time when he's quite old by the time God's pulling him into action. So
that has to be a real shaping period, doesn't it? I think like God's clearly shaping him in that environment. And if you look at the Hebrews, they were a shepherd people. So if he's going to lead these people, he has to be able to understand them. And if he's come out of royalty, essentially, he's come out of this family where everything's given to him on a plate almost, then God's kind of saying, well, you're going to live like the people you're going to lead out. And I think that's a really great example, and a good thing to look to as well when we're going through things that maybe we don't quite understand, and to think about how God might be preparing us for something that will be greater.
And it's very countercultural, isn't it? Because we want instant answers, we want instant sanctification, instant perfection. God takes a
instant
long time.
Purpose, I think, to be able to see, oh, this is valuable because, you know, I could imagine if I was him, I'd be like, oh, well, this is obviously the lesson I've got to learn. You know, what you just said, I think is really valid. Oh, I've got to learn how to identify. Well, actually, 40 years is a bit excessive. You know, I could learn that in 6 months or even 6 years, but 40 years. And God has a different timetable, doesn't he?
I think that's one of the things about Exodus as the book, is that God values things completely differently to us. I mean, I look at the creation narratives, and you've got like 2 chapters about the making of everything. In Exodus, you get chapter after chapter about the making of the tent pegs and the poles and stuff like that. And you think, well, why do we need that much detail? God thinks we do. He measures things differently. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Well, yeah, the God is in the detail. Like moving from there, obviously, he's tasked with going into Egypt, going back to Egypt, and doing what God has called him to do. A lot of people say that if God came to me right now, stood right in front of me and spoke to me, you know, he was there in person, then I would believe, absolutely. Well, Moses has had, I guess,
Plenty of that.
Plenty of that, and he does believe, but we see a lot of signs of fear in him. He doesn't really want to go at first, does he? He's adamant that he's not the right person for the job because he doesn't know how to speak, but God equips him. So what are your thoughts on his experience in Egypt and how he deals with Pharaoh?
I like it that he says, send somebody else. I like it that he says, oh, have you thought about Aaron? You know, he's better than me. You know, he can, because that's real. I don't see Moses as a gung-ho character. I mean, I think he was back in the day when he saw the injustice and killed the man. In a sense, it was all on the surface then. Whereas by the time he's back in Egypt, he seems very much more, I guess, humble. And I think sometimes we aspire to humility, but I think humility is horrible. To you know, to see yourself as the lowest or to perceive that you are is not very pleasant. And I kind of like that dynamic in him, that it's out of that place that he's obedient to God. He's not full of himself and his own ability.
One of my favourite verses in the Bible actually is Moses gets to the point of saying, well, how do I know you're sending me back in? I'm going to go back into the lion's den here. The last time I left, I was there, I was legging it for my life. Now you're asking me to go back in. How do I know you're sending me? And God kind of says to him, when you've brought them out, when you're on this mountain, you'll know that I've sent you. Oh, right. So how do I know you're asking me to do this? Well, when you've done it, you'll know.
Yeah.
It's just brilliant. I love that. I love that. Yeah, it's great.
That's what faith is all about, really, isn't it? And I think like we live in a culture where people want the results of faith before they take the step of faith.
Yeah.
Like I've noticed over the years how my faith has grown through hearing God or thinking that I've heard God, and then actually acting on that, and then after the action, then
Seeing
the
it.
results.
That's the
come.
thing.
I think it's, if nothing else, Exodus and the character of Moses certainly offers a great example of how to live by faith.
And not by sight. That's the kind of the nice little scriptural thing that we like to throw about, don't we? But really, if you could see it, it wouldn't be faith.
No. The character of God in Exodus. What do we learn about God?
Susan?
No, you did that last time.
Masses. We learn that he works through people. We learn that he's got a plan, a master plan. We learn that he doesn't stop awful things happening, but he's got an ultimate plan to sort out the mess. We learn that he's prepared to wait ages to get people right to do what they need. We learn that he's infinitely patient.
I was just thinking patience. The amount of, like, I'd have just, if I was God during Exodus, so many points I just said, right, that's it, I'm sick of it. do we have to go over this again and again and again?
And yet there is a line, you know, when Moses says to someone else, God actually gets cross with him, you know, come, enough's enough, I'm calling you to do this.
That is one of the things I wanted to pick up on, actually, is that because a lot of people, like detractors, I guess, would point to a lot of what God does in Exodus as one of the reasons why they couldn't actually put their belief in him, put their faith in him. I think it can be used often to paint God as the God of wrath and not the God of love. What's your response to that?
To your turn.
Well, it's interesting. I think that's a very interesting question. I think there's something actually that I see God doing in Exodus, which is it addresses those two poles, if you like, love and wrath, but looks at the same stuff from a slightly different dynamic that I find more compelling, I must admit, which is that he's holy. He's utterly good. He's utterly clean in the sense of ritual cleanness. He's utterly set apart, and yet he wants to live with his people. He's created this people for himself. He loves them, but that's a love that's it's an honest love. He's not deluded about them. You know, I think sometimes in life we're a bit insecure in our relationships because we hide the stuff that we don't find acceptable, and we think, oh, well, if you really knew me, then you wouldn't love me because I find it difficult, so how could anybody else accept it? And God's love is not, he knows all of that. So I find that really compelling, and still he wants to live with them. It builds and it builds and it builds, don't want to give the game away, but to the point towards the end of Exodus when God comes to live with his people. But the only way he can do that is if they are holy too, because holiness can't exist with unholiness, and I'm meaning that in terms of purity can't exist with uncleanness, and unless they live in a state of cleanness, really, he can't. I mean, sometimes people use that idea of you strike a match and the darkness disappears because the light destroys it. God could not exist with his people if any of that was there. So to me, I see, rather necessarily than love and wrath, I think there's another dynamic going on that sometimes we don't. It takes a bit more work to get your head around it, so sometimes we don't do that. But it's more a thing of cleanness, ritual cleanness, not just not having mud on your face, but the fact that when there's a death, that's not, when somebody kills somebody, that's not just, oh, I did a bad thing, and it's not just a bad thing for them and the other people. It's a pollutant. And God can't exist with that pollution. So he has to kind of set about building a people or creating a people, building a world where he can live with them, because that's what he wants.
I love what my learned wife has just said, and I agree entirely.
And you nodded off, you're in the middle of it.
What did you say? But there is something as well about, I want God to be wrathful about certain things. The Pharaoh can say to the Hebrews, throw the babies in the Nile, destroy babies at birth with impunity. Now, I want God to be angry at that. I want God to bring about some sort of sorting out of that situation, because when powerful regimes can basically do what they like, the small man in the street, in a sense, can't do much about that. That's what you need, a God who is all powerful, who cares for the lonely, who cares for the oppressed. And if he's not wrathful or angered or by those sort of things, then I'm looking for a different kind of God, in a sense. So I don't see wrath and love, if you like, as alternatives. Sometimes because you love, you hate injustice.
They have to coexist.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think about all the things like in life. You only have to flip the TV on and watch the news. So many things that anger you, where you just think, somebody do something about that. And it's like, I think we're all crying out for that in various places in the world, and in the things that we look at, the injustice that's around. But because of who we are, human beings, when we look at like God doing something about it, to see the truth in that and the justice in that, or it becomes something else entirely, I guess.
I think God often probably thinks, why aren't we doing more about it? He's given us this beautiful world to look after, and by and large we're squandering the resources that we've been given. We either hoard or we have nothing, and God isn't going to step in every few minutes. He's treating us with respect as image bearers, and I kind of think sometimes, how does he feel about this? And again, that's something I'm sure we might find out one day, that God's been thinking, I gave you so much, why didn't you make the most of what you had? And in one sense he has to step in ultimately, because we just don't seem capable of resolving the mess that we've created. But by and large, I think God does work through people. I do think about Moses. At least he had a sense of that injustice. And maybe that's partly what God saw in him and thought, well, here's somebody I can use. He just needed a lot of training to get right, but at least there was a passion there. I think one of the worries of one of the worries of our age is that we do watch the news and we watch these things and we're kind of like, oh right, yeah, and kind of carry on living our own selfish, self-centered, independent lives with no real concern for things that perhaps we ought to be more concerned about and doing more about. Rand.
One final thing that I guess I'd like to touch on is the promises of God, really, I think are shown throughout Exodus, I think, countless times, and not just to Moses and the Hebrews, but to Pharaoh himself. Like we talk about the wrath of God. Pharaoh had so much control in that situation to stop the wrath of God, because he was given warning after warning after warning, and it's not like those warnings didn't come without evidence. God didn't just come along and wipe them out. He didn't come along and he didn't choose the killing of the firstborns as the first plague. He started with something else and moved on and on and on, and to see that, to be witness to that, and to still be so stubborn that you reject God. As a particular characteristic of God is that he does promise us things and he does deliver on those promises.
I think if you watch a good parent in action, if their child is naughty, that there is there's often a warning, don't do that. And in a sense, I guess God's doing that with us, humanity, and particularly the Egyptian in this situation. That's part of the picture. And yet there's this horrible thing about the Egyptian culture, that they're worshipping many gods in a cruel and oppressive regime where the very few are living reasonable lives, but the majority are not. And I think God's heart is that this cannot be allowed to go on. What would have happened if God hadn't taken on the Pharaoh at that point? Often you think, well, God's been a bit extreme, or that's awful, how can you do that? But what we don't know is what would have happened if you hadn't. Yeah. And you see in political leaders, in our world, sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. But what you don't know is what would have happened if they hadn't acted. There's a brilliant film, you like films, I know those, so The Wonderful Life, where the character in that is shown a vision or in a dream, what would have happened if he hadn't have existed. Now we don't get to see that kind of thing very often, but you kind of think, well, what if God hadn't stepped in at certain times in history? What if the Egyptians had become the superpower of the whole world? The way they were treating the Hebrews gives an indication of what they thought of lesser people groups. Only God has enough circumstantial evidence and knowledge to see what would happen if, or what would happen if not. And I guess that's where faith comes in. You have to kind of say, it seems awful to us, but God knows the what happens if you didn't picture. And ultimately it comes down to believing that God is good and God is wise and God is knowledgeable. I think God hates to do some of these things, but there comes a point where it becomes the lesser of two evils, if you can apply that to God, that he has to take drastic action where there's a drastic problem.
There's a necessity in that.
I think the thing is, though, to some extent, we touched on this before, but I think part of the issue is who makes the decision about what's valid or not, what's valid rebuke, because actually, us saying, oh, what a bad God, that's us sitting in judgment over him. And if a child, you tell a child to stop doing whatever, when the child would feel that was unjust. And I think partly that's because they don't see the bigger perspective. They don't really know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But I think we're like that. He sees so much more than we do, but we find ourselves writing our rules for the world according to our standards. So, no, I don't like God because he did that. Well, I guess all of that other stuff then comes into play. Well, what would have happened if he hadn't done that?
Yeah.
Well, what would if just because you don't care about the the Hebrew babies, if you were their mummy, you might perceive that different. So there's all those kind of things come into play.
We kind of need to grow up, really, don't we?
Yeah, sometimes I think.
And faith comes into it. It is faith that God actually is good, and he knows what he's doing. And a lot of the Old Testament narratives do challenge that.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I think, you need to study these things and think and read and consider. It's very easy just to dismiss how awful, how can you believe in a God who does that? Well, there's more to think about. I think that the conversation needs to be a bit richer than simply that.
When we went to Congo, that did something into my perception, I must admit. And I thought, do you know what, I want a God that does something about this. And maybe he'll not do it now, and maybe he'll not do it during my lifetime, but I need to know that somehow these vulnerable little people are going to be validated.
A lot of people criticise the Bible for being very much against women. I think after reading Exodus, I'd have to beg to differ. What about you?
It's a super question, Brian, which I shall now defer
Yeah,
to my woman.
go on.
There you go. I love the fact that some of the big characters in Exodus, like the Pharaoh, aren't actually named. I mean, who is he? Which Pharaoh? People take a lot of trouble to work that out. We have the Hebrew midwives, whose names escape me, but we know who they are. And Moses' sister Miriam, we know who she is, and the little people, if you like, get an awful lot more attention than perhaps we might first realise. I mean, the reality was, I guess, in those days, it was a very patriarchal society. Men's strength ruled in a sense, but God doesn't seem to see it that way. We get that wonderful instance with Moses and Zipporah, who kind of basically comes and saves his life because he's kind of forgotten the basic rules with his own children. So we've got these kind of characters, these female characters named and treasured and valued in a book that doesn't value women well.
It's part of the beauty of the way that God has done it and still does it today, is that he works through the people in their time. It's a nonsense to take these stories out of their original context. They can only be understood in that context, and it was patriarchal, and yet God cuts through that.
That's the beauty of it, though, isn't
love
it?
it.
The fact
I love
that
it.
the context in which the New Testament was written, again, we're talking about a patriarchal society, yet the first people that Jesus comes to, reveals himself to, are women. And if you want to spread a new religion, if you want to start this, if you want to get this thing going in a patriarchal society, the last thing you're going to do is kick off with your main character, the focus of your story, approaching women, because it's just, you're living in a society
Shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, you're shooting yourself in the foot, basically.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think there's lots of women in Exodus that are just, they're on the ball all the time, showing the initiative, acting, and not in a kind of self-preservation way, but I mean, going back to the midwives, they literally put their lives on the line by refusing to do what Pharaoh has asked of them.
I love Miriam's song. That's
Yes.
another one. She's a warrior, you know. It's, you think about.
She's a worship leader.
Oh, she's incredible. And there's Moses going, "Oh, I'm not sure I can." And Miriam, and she's, she's fabulous.
And she
And
needs
yet
the
she does
rest
get.
of them.
She's not perfect.
No,
she gets it
no.
wrong as well. So it's not one being raised at the expense of the other. They're still human beings
flawed, aren't they?
with the propensity to make big mistakes. So,
But that applies to us all, though, isn't
Yeah.
it? It applies to men and women in the
Yeah.
Bible. And I just think, go to Moses' wife, when she's the one who... it's a very strange story, actually. It's just kind of thrust upon us that God is killing Moses. And it doesn't really say how. It just says something along those lines. But at the end of the day, it's his wife.
Zippy who comes to the rescue.
Yes, Zippy, Zipporah comes to the rescue and does what needs to be done in order to stop that from happening.
Snippy Zippy.
Snippy Zippy. But I've read a few interpretations of that story, and I've actually, when I read it, before reading commentaries about it, my first instinct was that, however bizarre this story is, she's acted in such a way that she's saved Moses' life and got him back on track. She's got something done that essentially he should have had done. He should have been the one who got it done. But I've read some interpretations that actually suggest, or try to suggest, that it was because of her sin or because she'd done wrong, and I find that quite preposterous. And do you think that's symptomatic of maybe still living in a patriarchal society? Do you think our understanding of many aspects of the Bible could maybe still be affected by... Because we like to think these days that society is changing and it's less patriarchal, but is that true?
I think whether it's on that particular issue in those particular instances, I don't know. I'd need to see which commentators said it and who they were, kind of thing. But I think it's very true that we see the world through our own spectacles, and we're quite dangerous in that if we don't realise it. If we realise it, that we are affected in our interpretation by our own context, by our own life experience, by our own gender, by all of those things. If we recognise that, then it becomes easier to work with that. I mean, none of us can help who we are. But it's when we deny that or we don't realise it that we become a bit dangerous, because that's when we impose things unknowingly on the text. We read it through our own filter to the point that we make it say things that it's not supposed to say. And I would say that's alive and kicking, that danger. And probably we all stumble into it more regularly than we, want to realise. But the first step in overcoming that or militating against it is realising that we're doing.
I guess I'm directing this at you, Sue, you being the woman of the group.
She certainly is.
Who do you identify with most in Exodus?
In Exodus.
Obviously I'm angling towards a female character.
You are.
Perspective.
I don't know whether I'm going to be able to give you one. I guess I remember saying something like this about Genesis, and I think this would still be true. So rather than identifying a particular character, I see that because it was the society that it was, and the structures that it had, and the negligible impact that women were supposed to have, and then the way that actually God turns some of those upside down. I don't know whether I identify with it, but I find it very hopeful that even in those circumstances, he honours them, but again, knowingly so. Like you said, I guess, John, that it's not like God doesn't do things like with a blunt cudgel banging something. To me, he seems real. So it's not like he's thinking to himself, I've got to make some point about women, so I've got to make the men look stupid and the women look heroic. Everybody's frail, and yet within that, the women are significant, and they're not just sidelined, as would have been the way. And I guess that's something that's so significant that, again, we don't necessarily see it because we would anticipate it today. Oh, well. Of course,
Because
the
I guess,
women
I mean,
matter.
like the idea within itself of a dominance, or if you want to call it
Yeah.
that, of either a man or a woman, or male or female. That within itself is an idea that comes from us
Yeah.
anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's us who are looking for that,
Yeah.
and I
And
guess,
finding things that reinforce it.
yeah, in order to back up our argument, depending on which side of the fence we sit on, I
Yeah.
imagine. But I don't think God looks at things like you said before. He finds stuff important that we don't.
Yeah.
He's looking at the details that we're completely missing.
Yeah.
Which is essentially in this case is that we're all significant.
Yeah.
It's not that one's above the other or below the other. It's just we're significant. You
We matter.
can be in the dirt and have everything on top of you, or you can be living in a palace and have everything done for you. But either way, in either situation, you can still be significant with regards to the work you do for God and where you fit in His world, in His scheme, I guess.
I think that's really important, and I think probably that's partly determined by how we perceive ourselves. You know, what's my identity? Do I perceive myself first and foremost as a woman, or do I perceive myself first and foremost as God's child, gender neutral, if you
Yes.
like? And I was just thinking as you were saying that, one of my favourite bits, I love it. It's hilarious, this bit in Exodus, when Moses has gone up the mountain
Oh,
and he's
I was
doing
gonna
this.
share that.
No, it's my bit. And he's up the mountain and he's doing all this stuff with God, and yeah, he's a man. But you know, if my identity was I'm a woman, then why is Moses up the mountain? Why is he doing it? And then he comes down and they've done all the business with the golden calf, and Aaron utters that immortal
Excuse.
oh, and he's like, well, we threw all our gold in the fire and look what came out. And I just think,
I can't believe you got that in. I was trying to think how to build that into it. You've just gone straight in there.
I just
You're
love
amazing.
that. But you see,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm amazing.
How have you got that into
If
this?
I perceived myself first and foremost as a woman, I would look at that and think, what a stupid man. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
What? I'm so glad that I'm different, that I'm not a man, because look what that stupid man did. Well, what a nonsense is that? Do you know what I mean?
It's irrelevant.
It's
as a man, isn't it?
irrelevant, exactly. So just as the, I'm not saying that I think gender is irrelevant. I don't.
Yeah.
You know, I think God deliberately subverts it, and I think, you know, in life we deliberately mess with it. But actually, where's my identity really? And I have to say, for me, I'm a child of God. So, you know, yeah. What do you want to say about that bit?
Nothing now.
I do think that's a great way to finish, though. Just to look at ourselves as children of God, and I've always tried to perceive myself as a child of God rather than a lot of the things that society places on us. We're so concerned with image and you know what we have and this, that, and the other.
What was that?
Nothing like that. My joy,
He's
my
looking at
sweet.
your hat.
I'm a child of God.
You are a child of God.
With my hat. I could be wearing my hat because I'm in the presence of holy men and I'm not supposed to, you know, la la la. It's not.
But on that note, this is 3 Children of God signing off.
Oh, man.